There's a thing that happens in the music industry when someone walks into a room and changes it. Not the room's temperature, or its noise level, or its configuration. Something harder to name than any of those things. A quality of attention that arrives from nowhere and rearranges itself around a specific person, the way iron filings rearrange around a magnet. People who have witnessed it describe it the same way, always. Not as something they decided to feel, as something that happened to them. On a Friday evening in the autumn of 1966, in a community hall in Gary, Indiana, it happened to a room full of people who had come to watch a talent competition. The person who caused it was 8 years old, and his voice was broken. The competition that mattered. Gary, Indiana in 1966 was a city that understood the weight of opportunity, a steel town built on industry, shaped by the specific combination of hard work and limited margin that defines places where people make things with their hands. The families who lived there understood, in the particular way that working people understand such things, that chances were not infinite, that when a door opened, you walked through it. The Roosevelt High School annual talent showcase was not by external measures a significant event. It was a community competition, local acts, local judges, a modest prize, an audience of families and neighbors filling folding chairs in a hall that smelled of floor wax and coffee from the urn at the back. But the judges included a man named Gerald Whitmore. Gerald was 44 years old, a former session musician who had worked the Chicago circuit for 2 decades before moving back to Gary to care for his mother. He knew people. He had connections that extended beyond the community hall, beyond Gary, into the infrastructure of the music industry in a way that nobody in the audience fully understood. Joseph understood it. Joseph had been preparing his sons for this night for 3 months. The family. The Jackson brothers had been performing together since Michael was old enough to stand beside a microphone and understand what a microphone was for. Jackie, the eldest, carried the group's stability, the consistent voice, the reliable presence, the older brother whose steadiness gave everyone else permission to take risks. Tito brought the guitar, the musical infrastructure around which everything else was built. Jermaine held the bass lines and the harmonies and the specific gravity of a middle child who understood his role precisely. Marlon brought energy, the kinetic physical commitment of someone whose performance was a full-body event. And Michael. Michael was the youngest, the smallest, the one whose voice, in the normal order of things, should have been the least, a child's voice, still forming, still finding what it would become. But the normal order of things had never quite applied to Michael. From the beginning, from the first time Joseph had watched his youngest son step in front of an audience and felt the room change, he had known that something was different. Not better yet, just different. The quality of what happened when Michael performed was not the quality of a talented child. It was something else, something that didn't have a category yet. Joseph had built the group around that something. Tonight was the night it was supposed to announce itself to the right person.
3 hours before. The Jackson brothers were in the side room that served as a backstage, a storage space, really, with folding tables pushed against the walls and coats piled on chairs, and the particular fluorescent harshness of a room not designed for anything important. They ran through the set one more time. Jackie's voice, Tito's guitar, Jermaine's bass run, Marlon's movement, and Michael's voice, which that afternoon had begun to do something wrong. It had started small, a slight roughness on the upper register, easily attributed to the dry autumn air or the dust of the storage room or the simple fact of a child who had been singing for hours. Michael had noticed it and said nothing, the specific silence of someone who knows that naming a problem might make it real. By 6 o'clock, 2 hours before the performance, it was no longer small. He spoke to Jackie, just to test, just to check, and what came out was not his voice. It was a sound in two registers simultaneously, the lower one his own, the upper one a stranger's, the two of them arriving together in the particular way that a breaking voice arrives, without warning, without control, with the complete indifference of a body doing what bodies do regardless of what is at stake. Jackie looked at him. Michael looked back. Neither of them said anything for a moment. Then Jackie went to find Joseph. What Joseph said. Joseph Jackson had spent 3 months preparing for this night. He had rehearsed his sons until the set was automatic, until every transition was smooth, until the rough edges of 5 brothers performing together had been worn down to something approaching seamless. He had pressed and altered their stage clothes himself. He had called in a favor to ensure they were placed in the second half of the program when the judge's attention was freshest. He had done everything that could be done. He had not prepared for this. When Jackie brought him to Michael, Joseph listened to his youngest son speak 3 words in the broken, double-registered voice of a body in the middle of a process it couldn't stop. Joseph was silent for a long moment. Then he said, "You're not going on." Not unkindly, not with the harshness that his son sometimes described in other contexts, simply as a fact, the assessment of a man who had calculated the variables and reached a conclusion. "The group goes on without you tonight. We go as 4. Michael looked at him. He was 8 years old, and he was standing in a fluorescent storage room 2 hours before the most important performance of his family's life, and his voice had broken, and his father had just told him he was out. He said, "Let me go on." Joseph shook his head. "With that voice, you'll cost us the whole night." Michael was quiet for a moment. The storage room was very still, his brothers nearby, watching, nobody speaking. Then Michael said something that none of them forgot. He said, "The voice isn't the whole thing. Let me show you." The decision. Joseph Jackson did not change his mind easily. He had built his son's career on discipline, on precision, on the principle that you did not go in front of people unless you were ready, unless you had prepared, unless you could deliver what you had promised. Improvisation was risk. Risk was irresponsibility. Irresponsibility was the thing that kept people in Gary, Indiana, when they should have been somewhere else. He looked at his youngest son, 8 years old, voice broken, completely calm. The calmness was the thing. Joseph had watched Michael perform dozens of times. He knew what Michael looked like before a performance, the energy that gathered in him, the specific readiness of a child who had been born understanding what a stage was for. He had seen Michael nervous. He had seen Michael uncertain. He had never seen Michael this calm. It was not the calm of someone who didn't understand what was at stake. It was the calm of someone who had already resolved the question internally and was now simply waiting for the external world to catch up. Joseph looked at him for a long moment. He stepped aside.
The hall. The Roosevelt High School annual talent showcase was running 20 minutes behind schedule by the time the Jackson brothers were called. The audience, 300 people on folding chairs, the hall warm with the accumulated presence of an evening already well underway, had seen 7 acts, a local gospel quartet, 2 solo vocalists, a comedy duo that had landed unevenly, a teenage girl who played piano with the kind of technical precision that impresses adults and leaves children cold. Gerald Whittemore, in the 3rd row with a notepad on his knee, had written 4 lines of notes across the entire evening. He was not expecting the Jackson brothers to change that. The 5 brothers took the stage. Michael was at the end of the line, the smallest, the youngest, positioned where the youngest is positioned, slightly to the side, the one the eye finds last. Tito's guitar began. Jackie's voice took the opening line. The group moved into the first song with the smooth coordination of 3 months of rehearsal, tight, professional in a way that was surprising from boys this young, the kind of performance that makes audiences sit up slightly in their chairs. Gerald Whittemore wrote 2 words, underlined once. Then the song reached Michael's section, the broken voice. Michael stepped toward the microphone. He was small enough that the microphone stand, adjusted to its lowest position, was still slightly too high. He had to angle his face upward slightly, the specific posture of a child performing in a world built for larger people. He opened his mouth. The first note came out broken. Not subtly, not in a way that might be missed or charitably interpreted. The voice split, the lower register holding, the upper register collapsing into something that was not quite a crack and not quite a squeak, but existed in the unhappy territory between the two. The microphone carried it, unmediated, to every corner of the hall. 300 people heard it. The hall went quiet in the specific way that halls go quiet when something unexpected has happened and nobody is certain yet whether it is a problem or something else. The band continued. The music held its shape. Michael held the microphone. In the wing, Joseph Jackson closed his eyes. What happened next? For approximately 2 seconds, nothing happened. Michael stood at the microphone with the broken voice still hanging in the air of the hall, in front of 300 people who were waiting, in the particular suspended state of an audience that had witnessed a stumble and hasn't yet decided how to feel about it. Then something shifted. It began in his body, not his voice, his body, the shoulders dropping into a different position, the weight redistributing, the specific physical language of a performer settling into something that had nothing to do with the broken voice and everything to do with what the broken voice had left behind. When the voice fails, what remains is everything else. And in Michael Jackson, at 8 years old, everything else was already something that 300 people in a community hall in Gary, Indiana, had never encountered in a single room before. He moved. Not the choreography of rehearsal, something looser, more direct, more instinctive than that. The movement of someone who has stopped managing the performance and started inhabiting it, who has, in the specific crisis of a broken voice, found the freedom that comes when there is nothing left to protect. His face opened. The practiced stage expression fell away, and what replaced it was something rawer and more present, the face of a child who was not performing at the audience, but performing toward them, at them, into the specific silence that his broken voice had created. The hall stayed quiet, but the quality of the quiet changed. It was no longer the silence of 300 people deciding how to respond to a mistake. It was the silence of 300 people who had forgotten to respond at all.
What Gerald Whittemore saw. Gerald Whittemore stopped writing. He had been a session musician for 20 years. He had been in rooms with talent, real talent, the professional kind, the kind that had been developed and refined and brought to a functional excellence. He understood the difference between a good performer and an exceptional one. He did not have a category for what he was watching. The voice was broken. That was simply true, audible, undeniable, the kind of technical failure that ends auditions in the first 30 seconds. By any professional standard, the performance should have been over. It was not over. The child at the microphone had taken the broken voice and done something with it that Gerald Whittemore, in 20 years of professional music, had not seen before. He had not fixed it. He had not compensated for it. He had not pretended it hadn't happened.
He had rendered it irrelevant. By being so completely, so entirely himself in that moment, so present, so direct, so fully committed to the communication of something that had nothing to do with technical perfection, he had made the broken voice a detail, a small thing, a fact about a Tuesday in autumn that had no bearing on what was actually happening. Gerald Whitmore looked at his notepad. He wrote one word. Then he stopped and looked at the stage again. He crossed the word out. He wrote something else. Later, when he showed the notepad to a colleague, the colleague asked what the crossed-out word had been. Gerald said, "Talented." "What did you replace it with?" Gerald was quiet for a moment. "I wrote, 'This is different.'" The end of the song. The song ended. The hall came back to itself, 300 people returning from wherever they had been for the previous 3 minutes, the collective exhale of an audience releasing something it had been holding. The applause when it arrived was not the polite applause of a community competition audience rewarding adequate performance. It was the applause of people who were still processing what they had seen and were using their hands because their hands were the only available instrument. Michael stepped back from the microphone. He was 8 years old and his voice was broken. And he had just done something that nobody in the hall could fully articulate, but everyone had fully felt. In the wing, Joseph Jackson opened his eyes. He watched his youngest son step back from the microphone and take his place at the end of the line. Michael did not look at his father. He looked at the audience. And he smiled, not the performance smile, but the private one, the small one, the one that belonged to whoever was inside the performance, looking out. After. Gerald Whitmore sought out Joseph Jackson during the intermission. He did not talk about the broken voice. He did not mention it, did not refer to it, did not treat it as a factor in any direction, not an obstacle that had been overcome, not a problem to be addressed going forward. He talked about Michael. He said, "I've been doing this for 20 years. I want you to know what I saw tonight." Joseph listened. "What I saw tonight doesn't come from training, it doesn't come from rehearsal, it doesn't come from anything you can teach." He paused. "It comes from wherever that child lives when he's not on stage. And wherever that is, it's somewhere different from where the rest of us live." Joseph was quiet. "You already know this," Gerald said. It was not a question. "Yes," Joseph said. Gerald nodded. He handed Joseph a card, a name, a phone number, a Chicago address. "Call this person," he said, "this week." He walked back into the hall. Joseph stood in the corridor and looked at the card for a long time. Then he put it in his jacket pocket. What Jackie said. 40 years later, in an interview, Jackie Jackson was asked about his earliest memory of understanding who Michael was. He described a night, a community hall, a broken voice. "I was standing in the wing watching him, and when his voice cracked, I felt, I don't know, the thing you feel when you think something is about to go wrong and you can't stop it." He paused. "And then it didn't go wrong. It went somewhere else, somewhere none of us had been." The interviewer asked, "When did you know?" Jackie looked at him. "That night," he said. "I knew that night." Not because of what he did with his voice, because of what he did when his voice stopped working. Another pause. The voice was never the point with Michael. The rest of us had voices. Michael had something that needed a voice the way a river needs a riverbank, just to give it edges, just to give you somewhere to look. Without the voice, the river was still there. You just saw it more clearly. The final word. Michael Jackson went on to sell 400 million records. He made music that reached every country on earth, in every language, in every context that music can reach, from the largest stadiums ever filled to the smallest radios in the smallest rooms of people who needed something and found it in a song. All of it began somewhere. It began in a lot of places, in a lot of moments, in the accumulated experience of a child who had been performing before he could read. But the people who were in a community hall in Gary, Indiana on a Friday evening in the autumn of 1966 would tell you that it began there. Not because of what went right, because of what went wrong. Because an 8-year-old boy's voice broke in front of 300 people at the worst possible moment, and instead of stopping, instead of stepping back, instead of giving the audience the apology that a broken voice usually demands, he showed them what the voice had been covering. And what was underneath it was everything. If this story moved you, subscribe and share it with someone who needs to be reminded that your greatest moment might be hiding just behind your biggest failure. Leave a comment below. Has something going wrong ever revealed something better? We read every single one.